hand the keys over to you. So you've got a few minutes extra time, so slightly less pressure. So I'll hand it over to you. Thank you so much for coming today.
Great, thank you. It's how organized this is. It's crazy. So I know so much time has gone into this, and yeah, thanks also to everyone taking the time to watch this. Sorry, it's saying that my mic is on mute, but it's not. Okay, fine. That's Microsoft Teams for you. So yeah, so I'm going to talk about questionable research practices today. It's quite a challenging topic to talk about because questionable research practices are really diverse. They are different in terms of severity, they're different in terms of prevalence, they're different in terms of what motivates them. And I think what I want to do in the next 20 or so minutes is just show how that diversity a bit. So I'll explain what I mean by questionable research practice. I'll go on and discuss a couple of them in more detail and also why they might happen. So I will just start by explaining what is a questionable research practice. In the word itself, it kind of says that it's a gray area, something which is questionable. It's not completely wrong and it's not completely right. And maybe at the end of this talk, it'd be interesting to reflect whether that's true. Are they really a gray zone, or are they completely wrong, or where do we stand? And I think that makes the nomenclature of questionable research practice quite complicated to deal with. So coming from Stuart's talk, we have kind of data falsification at the end, where we would probably all agree that that's not questionable. That's just really wrong. Going all the way to something that might be very benign, and where we would probably all agree that that might be questionable or might be completely okay. And I think that somebody who's explained this really well is in this satirical article by Neuroskeptic in Perspectives on Psychological Science, where they talk about the 9 circles of scientific hell. So you can see that at the very bottom of hell, there's inventing data. So this is what we just heard about: falsification, fraud, and that's definitely not questionable. And then you go through the levels, and at the very top, you have things like overselling, post hoc storytelling, maybe a bit of p-hacking, a bit of outlier removal to get your results just right, which I think are pretty prevalent. So you can see this real continuum between something like overselling to something like fraud. And that continuum gets complicated by different prevalences. So this is data which sadly I only found for psychology, but I think gives us a good indication for other fields as well. So this was a questionnaire of researchers asking them how much they themselves did certain questionable research practices and how much they expected others to have done that. So the black columns are the self-admission, so I've done this. The white columns is the prevalence of others. The gray ones we won't be discussing today is kind of an extrapolation, which has been discussed in detail. So I don't think we're going to cover those today. But you see at the kind of sides, the first 2 columns are the most prevalent questionable research practices, about 60 to 70% in terms of self-admission and prevalence. And it's failing to report all dependent measures. So maybe you had a couple of outcome measures and you only reported some of them, if that's a clinical trial or a wet lab experiment or a social scientific study, or collecting more data after seeing whether results were significant. Then kind of at the other end of the graph, there's things that kind of questionable research practices that are around 30 to 50%, up to almost 60% prevalence, which are selectively reporting studies that worked, excluding data after looking at the impact of doing so, and claiming to have predicted an unexpected finding. Again, these are really quite prevalent if you think that around 35 to 50% of researchers self-admit to have done this before. then we start going into the more questionable area of questionable research practices. In the middle of the graph, there are 3 questionable research practices that only about a quarter self-admit to have done themselves. That's failing to report all conditions, stopping data collection after achieving their desired result, and rounding down p-values. So if you had, for example, a p-value of 0.055 or 52, again, you can really say that the p-value was under 0.05, but if you round down, it could kind of make it look like it was. That's already, for me, I don't think it's very questionable anymore. For me, that is verging on something that's clearly wrong, but it's still kind of subsumed under the QRP umbrella. And then at the very right side of the graph, we have 2 which are, I think, completely wrong to do, falsely claiming that results are unaffected by demographics and falsifying data. And as Stuart has shown, there's still quite a high self-admission rate, even for falsifying, data falsification of around 1% to 2%. So we have this kind of spectrum of severity and also a spectrum of prevalence, and I think they do relate to each other. We more commonly engage in those that are less severe, also maybe because we feel like other people do that or because we were taught to do so. I personally dropped dependent measures from my undergrad thesis after being instructed to do so. So we're actually, these questionable research practices are really a weight on the scientific integrity of our research. It should make us question a lot more things that we see in the everyday literature. However, from the same study, it seems like a lot of people don't really doubt scientific integrity as much. And I think that's something that, again, mirrors Stuart's talk. We trust, but we don't verify. And here, if researchers are asked if they've ever had doubts concerning their own research integrity, most people say never. The same with when you ask researchers about their collaborators, most of them feel like, they don't question their collaborators either. Graduate students, it already changes a bit. People say that they once or twice doubted a graduate student, and that's quite similar to people from their own institution. The only time when it moves away from that is when you ask people about researchers at other institutions, where it's about 50-50 from having doubted integrity once or twice or occasionally. So again, the doubt is still very, very rare if people only once or twice have doubted researchers in their academic career. It's actually not that much if you think about the problems we know that exist in the research field. So we have kind of a real spectrum of QRPs, spectrum of prevalence, but they don't really seem to affect how we judge the research integrity as much of our own work and then a bit of other people's work. However, it's been very clear, especially in the last 10 years, that QRPs actually severely curtail the effectiveness of our literature. One of the ways to get a grip on what QRPs might be doing is to look at the distribution of p-values in scientific literature. So here is a distribution of p-values in scientific papers, and it looks like it's 2 separate curves. There's something really weird going on around a magical p-value of 0.05. This red line, there's a real discontinuity, and 0.05 has nothing magical about it. So what we should actually be seeing is a continuous curve going down if we are studying true effects. That needs to be said. So what we see at 0.05 is probably researchers who got 0.051 or 0.056 kind of trying their best to push it under the 0.05 boundary, which moves some of the kind of papers that should have been in the 0.05, 556 category into the under 0.05, and which causes this discontinuity to appear. Further, and this is sadly again a psychological paper, but really one of, I think, the best papers that have really caused the field to wake up. And a lot of people say that this paper was their wake-up point, their point where they saw that things were actually really wrong in the literature, was the paper by Simmons, Nelson, and Simenson in 2011, where they showed that with questionable research practices, with analytical flexibility kind of changing little things and seeing what happens, you could actually find things that you know shouldn't be true to be true. So you can make anything you want as significant and present it as such in the scientific literature. They didn't just say this, they actually demonstrated it. So they did 2 studies. For example, in the second study, they had students listen to When I'm 64 from the Beatles and Kalimba, which is a Windows operating system theme tune. And they found that those students that listened to When I'm 64 actually became younger, sorry. They became younger, which we know can't be true. Sadly, I won't get younger when I listen to certain types of music. But they didn't, for example, falsify their data. They didn't do anything of what Stuart was talking about. They actually did everything that maybe other researchers were doing as well in their own work. And they display this in a table where they show that actually they didn't have just 2 conditions, they had 3. And they measured loads of different covariates like gender, and they flexibly looked whether that would change the result. They added some more participants if things were non-significant. And in that way, they had the flexibility to find something that worked, to find that result that they were looking for. And in some really effective simulations, they found that if you do these 4 questionable research practices, that you have 2 dependent variables, 2 outcomes, and you choose one. If you add more observations, if you control for gender or not, and you're flexible about that, or if you drop conditions, and you use a normal alpha level of 0.05, so p-value of 0.05, actually, if you're studying something that doesn't exist, you have a 60% chance of finding that it does exist. So again, if I'm studying something that is completely wrong and false, and I do 100 studies, and I have these questionable research practices up my sleeve, in 60 of them, I'd find that what I actually hypothesize is true. So this can really mislead the literature. And in a later paper, the authors wrote that it was really a moment where people thought questionable research practices were like jaywalking. You know, we all sometimes walk over the street on a red light, but they found that it's actually as bad as robbing a bank. And I think that change in perspective has really happened, at least in psychology, in the last couple of years. So I hope what you got from this first part of my talk is that QRPs are, you can see that I'm probably a bit skeptical of the name. They are a spectrum, both in diversity and severity and in prevalence, but they seem really widespread, and we don't really seem to yet really understand the severity of this that it kind of puts onto our literature, except maybe the people listening to this talk. So let's have a look at some of the QRPs in a bit more detail. And I've chosen 3. There are many more that you could look at. The first is Harking, so hypothesizing after the results are known. For example, if I do a study and I had a certain hypothesis that something will happen in a certain direction, for example, well-being is going to increase, and I find that well-being is going to actually decrease, I change my hypothesis to say I actually predicted that my kind of psychiatric trial would have caused well-being to decrease. If we go back to the study in psychologists, this is actually quite a prevalent QRP, claiming to have predicted an unexpected finding. The self-admission rate was around 35, the prevalence estimate was around 50. So kind of we expect that 50% of other researchers do this. And we probably expect it because it's something that we have been taught to do, or at least recommended to do. So some of these examples are very psychology heavy, and I'm sorry about that. But Orben, who was a psychologist in the 1980s, well, he then caused the whole replication crisis later on, but that's a story for another day, wrote a kind of advice booklet for psychology students, saying that there are 2 possible articles you can write when you're writing a scientific paper. A, the article you plan to write when you designed your study, or B, the article that makes most sense now that you've seen the result. They are rarely the same, and the correct answer is B. So he's saying that you should hark. And this isn't just advice from the 80s. I found this article in eLife from a non-psychologist in 2019 who said that if you try to fit the answer to the question in your article, you risk upending with a compendium of results that is less cohesive than it could be. Instead, start with the answer, figure out what the question should have been, and build on that. This seems counterintuitive, but it works. It is the first step in crafting a story. So naturally, this is the way to craft a compelling story, and that's where the incentives align. We are still expected to have a kind of compelling result when we submit to journals of a certain kind of prestige, which are still important for us to get certain types of jobs. But what we've seen before is that by doing this, yes, we're crafting a story, but we're moving further away from the truth, which is a real problem because we're not storytellers, we're scientists. So the second QRP I want to focus on is selective reporting. It's quite different from Harking because it's all about either cherry picking, so selecting the studies that worked and reporting those, or selective omission, kind of deleting the things that don't work and not reporting those. Again, they're quite prevalent and even more prevalent than Harking. Selectively reporting studies that worked had a prevalence between 50 and 60%. Further, failing to report all dependent measures, again, a prevalence around 60%. Less prevalent is failing to report all conditions in a study. It's around 25 to 40%. But again, this is something which we know is wrong, but that has been actively condoned and kind of suggested we should do in the literature. In the 1830s, Charles Babbage already said that this is a real problem. So we've known that, for example, cherry picking has been a problem for a long time. In his book, Reflections on the Decline of Science in England, he talked about cherry picking as cooking. And he said that cooking is an art of various forms, the object of which is to give to ordinary observations the appearance and character of those of the highest degree of accuracy. One of its numerous processes is to make multitudes of observations, and out of these to select only those only which agree or very neatly agree. If 100 observations are made, the cook must be very unlucky if he cannot pick out 15 or 20, which will do for serving up. So, for example, if we're in a wet lab, you could do 100 observations, and if you only choose the 15 or 20 that work best, you could probably write a very compelling story. Again, it's not showing what kind of the actual scientific observations and fact. This can also happen in medical trials. Ben Goldacre at the University of Oxford has done some brilliant work showing medical trials actually going away from their pre-registered outcomes to choose those that work to report, or in social scientific studies where maybe I have a couple of different outcomes and I only report those that worked as well. And again, this was condoned by the eLife article in 2019. In presenting your results, you have to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. What you don't have to do is tell the whole truth. In other words, you can select the results you present. And then it goes on to say that this will help shape your narrative and that you should be ruthless in omitting things. That is mirrored in advice given by one of the most kind of influential psychological editors in 2004. Susan Fiske, in his book, said that to make an empirical argument, you need to only represent the strongest studies. She says that most researchers are tempted, having gone to enormous trouble to run each study, to include every last one with every last measure that might be relevant. And then she said that unfortunately, several weak studies do not equal one strong study, and you shouldn't become attached to your studies. You have to be cold and hard and leave things aside if necessary. So there, it's almost saying, oh yes, you want to include everything, you want to do it, but you should actually not, you should exclude everything. Naturally, this was written in 2004, and there was actually a really interesting Twitter conversation about this recently when I posted about it. So two psychologists here were conversing around this paragraph by Susan Fiske. Ben Jones said, wow. And then John Brooke replied that, to be fair, I think if I'd read that in 2004, I thought it was good advice. I probably would too, but in 2004, I was a PhD student. In 2004, Fisk was editing Annual Review of Psychology, one of the kind of prestigious journals in our field. Point being, I'm not sure many people at the time realized this was terrible advice. I mean, it's arguably still good career advice, but in 2004, I think most people thought what was good for career advancement was aligned with what's good for science. In the graduate course around open science that I teach at the University of Cambridge, this is something that comes up time and time again, that what we've really just started to notice in the last couple of years is that what's good for scientists, publishing in good journals, writing a story, writing something compelling, is not good, what's good for science. And so I think what we'll do is talk a lot about incentives today, because that's really one of those crucial pain points driving a lot of these problems. Further, something that Dorothy is going to talk about right after my talk is that by, for example, selectively omitting studies, we're really skewing the literature. For example, if we only report those studies that worked, those kind of effects will be magnified through publication bias and citation bias and spin. And we'll end up with a literature that seems, for example, that a positive medical trial was actually positive, like this trial was really helpful, but only because all the negative scientific data, the things that didn't find anything, were omitted. Also, something that I often ask myself is, what would the public feel? A lot of us get our salaries paid by the public. Our studies are funded by the public through taxpayer or through philanthropy or through other means. And in this study of 400 members of the public, they were asked about certain types of QRPs and how they would feel about it. So, for example, if a researcher falsified their data, over 90% thought that was completely morally unacceptable, they should be fired, they shouldn't receive any more funding, and then 2/3 thought that should be a crime. You should go to court, stand up to this problem. With selective reporting, something that editors in our fields and kind of advice given to students actively condones as a form of helping your career advancement, over kind of 60 to 70% of the public still think that's completely morally unacceptable. You should be fired and you should receive a funding ban. And over 1/3 think that that should be a crime. So if 100 members of the public were listening to this talk, about 37 of them would feel like those people that are doing this, they shouldn't just be fired. You should be going to court. This is a misuse of public funds. And I think that should make us think a lot harder around what we're doing, because while we have the trust of the public, we're often quite lenient with how we use that important trust that kind of we build our careers on. The last QRP I want to talk about is p-hacking. P-hacking is quite commonly known to be a problem. I think one of the QRPs that we're most acquainted with. So I just have an example. For example, in my own research, I might be just doing a study around how social media is linked to depression in lockdown for teenagers. Social media might be a really important form of contact, or it might lead to more depression. We don't know. So we have a study, it has low and high social media users, and that's linked to depression. Actually, what I know as an omnipresent individual, and I actually don't, but let's just imagine, is that there's no link. Social media is so diverse, and the lockdown is kind of changing us so much that there's no link between social media use and depression. So we're looking at something that isn't there. We're looking for something that isn't there. If we just look at the whole sample, the probability of us finding that actually there is a link, even though it's not there, is 5% if we put our p-value at 0.05. It's calculated in a way as 1 minus the probability of not finding a significant result, which is 0.95. But for example, I could split my data. I could look at old and young adolescents. And actually that's something I look at in real life. And so all of a sudden, the probability of finding at least one significant p-value is 0.1, 10%, because it's 1 minus 0.95, which is kind of the first path of the probability of finding no significant result, 0.95, times the other path, which again is 0.95. But again, we can split the data even more. For example, we want to look at single parent household versus both parent households, because that might be really important. And now all of a sudden we're doing 4 contrasts. We're running 4 separate analyses. It's 1 minus 0.95 times 0.95 times 0.95 times 0.95, which means that we now have a 19% probability of finding a significant effect, even though it's not there. We can go even further, splitting sex. That means we now have a 34% chance of finding something that's not there. And if we go on and even split it from urban and rural communities, we actually now have an over 50% chance of finding an effect that is not there. So again, p-hacking can have real significant kind of effect on our literature, promoting false positives, which makes them really problematic. P-hacking, however, is condoned here in this book on social scientific studies from both sociology and economics and psychology. It said that you should measure loads of different demographic and control variables because they'll allow you to rescue your study from the potential obscurity of the file drawer, because you can slice the data in certain ways that maximizes your publication opportunities. And, you know, finding no significant effects would be worse because the study wouldn't be published. So, you know, they'll help you salvage your work. My last couple of slides in the last couple of minutes is that actually it's not just incentives that are cognitive explanations for these QRPs. And this again is work from Dorothy Bishop in bringing these ideas together. So QRPs aren't just driven by kind of our bad incentives, it's also sometimes our own psychology. You know, we have a very good ability to spot patterns in noise, which is something that Marcus Manaffa will talk about in kind of 2 talks from now. We also have a systematic misunderstanding of probability. For example, this is an example Daniel Lakens uses a lot, where he said that, you know, imagine performing 3 studies and only 2 are significant. A lot of us think that that's not actually convincing evidence, but if the studies are well powered to about 80%, 0.8 times 0.8 times 0.8 is 0.5, which means that in 3 well-powered studies, it's actually quite likely that one of them will be non-significant, something that I think I haven't really understood for a long time. We also need narratives and schemas and stories. And again, that comes back, stories are really important. And we often are told we have to tell a story. And that's also because of our own psychology. And last, we have confirmation bias and selective attention and memory. Again, something that we'll cover in the rest of this conference. So QRPs are really diverse. They're really quite prevalent. And I don't think we yet understand how bad they are. Since the beginning of the replication crisis, more people now think QRPs are more like robbing a bank than jaywalking. But incentives or cognitive structures still make them kind of an uphill struggle to remove. Thank you very much.
Absolutely wonderful, Amy. You are dangerously effective at putting forward a compelling argument. We have a lot of interest from people. We have one question that's got quite a number of votes, so I'll just fire them to you now. So from Catherine Bates, as an early career researcher, how can we be confident that a quality approach to research will be acknowledged and will hold weight in funding and job applications? Open science approaches often results in slower science and less publications or less exciting results.
I think this is still a major concern for people, but times are really changing. You know, I finished my PhD a year ago, and I feel like people are starting to really value this. And I think that in the next couple of years, departments will see that they need to teach these things and they need people who are able to teach this. So starting to embrace these new ways of working. Yes, it's hard and it's a risk and it's a gamble, but many things in our careers are risks and gambles, and we need to do those to actually survive an incredibly competitive system. And I think that it's a risk or a gamble that I think makes sense to do now. It's not only the correct thing to do, and it's something that you will have to live with for the rest of your career if you stay in academia. It's also something that I think will make strategic sense. Lots more funders are interested in open science practices, and they're really difficult. You need time to learn, you need time to apply them. and you're under such additional scrutiny that it's often quite nerve-wracking knowing that your data is online. But I do think that they are starting to be very worthy risks to take. And I know it's hard, and there's been a lot of tears shed in this household about certain types of kind of moves to make things more open, and people then being able to criticize your work, or things taking longer. But yeah, I'm so happy I did that in my PhD. It completely changed the way I work, knowing that I'm going to publish things whatever the results are. I'm just going to try my best. And I was like, wow, trying your best instead of knowing you have to find something compelling or